3 men came through her gate at 2 in the morning. She was already waiting. Not in the house, in the barn, standing in the dark beside her horse, back flat against the wall, hand near the holster. She'd been there for 4 hours. Because when you know they're coming, you don't light a lamp and sit by the window. You go somewhere, they won't think to look. She watched through the cracked door as they spread across the yard. Professional. Practiced. The kind of men who'd done this before and expected it to go the usual way. It didn't go the usual way. She stepped out of the shadow. 3 men turned at once. She looked at the one in the middle, the leader, the one getting paid to be calm, and said exactly what she needed him to carry back to the man who sent him. Then the youngest one made a mistake. He reached for his gun. She was faster. Not because she was a gunfighter. Because she'd already decided, 4 hours ago in the dark, exactly when she was going to move. The shot took him in the shoulder. Not the chest. That was a choice. Laura noticed her coffee was hot this time. Small thing, she almost missed it standing at the kitchen window with the basin still dark, below the pre-dawn line, the cup already at her lips before she registered the warmth of it. 8 months of cold coffee, of forgetting she'd poured it, of coming back to find it sitting on the counter like an accusation. And now, on a Tuesday morning in late September, she was drinking it while it was still hot. She didn't try to make that mean something. She'd spent enough of the past 8 months trying to make things mean something, reading patterns into ordinary events, searching the routine of the farm for signals that didn't exist. The coffee was hot because she'd poured it and immediately picked it up, and that was the entire story of the hot coffee. But she stood at the window longer than she needed to, because the basin, in the last few minutes before dawn, had a quality she never got tired of: the way the darkness wasn't uniform, the way it had gradations that became visible only if you stood still long enough to let your eyes adjust. The hills to the north were a different dark than the sky above them. The east field was a different dark than the South Creek line. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the property boundary, 200 acres that she knew so precisely she could walk every foot of it. Blind, held its shape in the dark the way things do when you have put enough of yourself into them. The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days. She'd received it from the county sheriff's substation on a Saturday, delivered by a deputy who had the expression of someone performing a task he'd been given without being told what it was. County seal. Her name on the front spelled correctly, which meant someone had looked it up rather than guessing. She'd set it on the table when he left, and then gone back out to finish the afternoon work, because the afternoon work didn't stop for envelopes. Saturday she didn't open it. Sunday she moved it to the far side of the table, so it wasn't directly in her line of sight when she ate. Monday she moved it back to the center, because avoiding it was its own kind of acknowledgement. And she wasn't going to acknowledge things she hadn't yet decided how to handle. Tuesday morning, before dawn, with coffee still hot in her hand, she opened it. 4 pages. Legal language throughout, the kind that was designed to be precise and achieved a kind of opacity through that precision, sentences that looped back through their own clauses before landing on the point. She read it slowly, which was how her father had taught her to read legal documents, not skimming for the conclusion, but tracking the structure, because the structure told you as much as the content. A deed of transfer. 200 acres, Sulphur Basin Parcel 14, Clark Homestead, to Harris Land and Mineral Company. Dated January 4, 1879. Signed by Thomas Clark. Notarized by a county notary, seal affixed, $400. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and drank her coffee. Thomas had been alive on January 4th. He'd been alive for 10 more days after that. She knew his signature the way she knew the layout of this house in the dark, not by thinking about it, but through the accumulated experience of 9 years of letters and notes and the small documentary evidence of a shared life. The grocery list pinned to the cabinet when he went to the feed store. The letter from Tonopah the spring before last, 4 pages front and back, filled with observations about rain, and a leaking hotel roof, and what he missed about home. The signature on their original deed, filed at the county records office the spring they'd bought this property. She looked at the T in Thomas. On this document, Thomas pulled the crossbar of his T long to the right, almost like a dash extending past the letter. He'd done this for as long as she'd known him, one of those physical habits so ingrained the person who has them doesn't know they exist. She'd pointed it out to him once, years ago, and he'd looked at his own handwriting with the genuine surprise of someone encountering a fact about themselves they'd never noticed. The T on this deed ended early. Shorter crossbar, neatened up. Someone who had studied Thomas's signature carefully had produced this one carefully enough that the overall impression was correct, not so carefully that every particular was right. She folded the deed and put it in the inside pocket of her work coat. Then she went to the barn. Ember was already awake, which was usual. The mare was 8 years old and red as October, and hazoped, and had the specific patience of an animal that had learned to distinguish between a person who came to the barn because they needed to talk, and a person who came because they needed to not talk. Laura had needed both kinds of company in the past 8 months, and Ember had provided both without being asked. She stood with her hand on the horse's neck for a while and thought about January 14th. The fire had started in the old barn. She'd woken to the smell of smoke at some hour in the early morning too, maybe 2:30, the kind of hour when the body's instincts respond before consciousness catches up, and she'd run out to find the structure fully engaged, and Thomas already inside it, and there was nothing she could do about either of those facts. The fire had its own logic by then, the particular logic of something that has been given time to establish itself before being noticed. The official finding was a lamp. An oil lamp positioned at the feed storage area, possibly knocked by a horse, possible accident, investigation closed within 2 weeks. She'd accepted this because she had no counter-evidence. And because grief, in its first weeks, doesn't produce the clarity needed for counter-argument. It produces something else entirely, a flattening of everything that isn't immediately necessary, a narrowing of the possible to what's directly in front of you, the next task, and the next one, and the one after that. But she'd thought about it. Every day she'd thought about it. Thomas had not been careless with lamps. He'd been careless about his gloves, and about whether he'd eaten enough, and about the particular birthday that happened in March, that he never remembered until reminded, but he was not careless about anything that could hurt the farm or the animals or her. She had never once in 9 years gone to bed while he was still in the barn, without seeing him carry the lamp back to the house. The deed in her coat pocket was 10 days before he died, signed by a man who, the evidence of her own hands and eyes and 9 years of familiarity told her, had not signed it. She saddled Ember and rode towards Sweetwater Junction. The road north was 6 miles of dry scrub and red dust, and the particular quality of Nevada morning air, in late September, cold at the edges, carrying the faint mineral smell of the basin that she'd stopped noticing years ago, and had only become aware of again recently, the way you notice things you've been living with so long they've become part of the texture of ordinary experience. The sun was still low enough that the shadows ran long to the west. Ember's shadow elongated and slightly distorted on the road ahead of them. She thought about what she was going to do and in what order. The first thing was Scott. The deputy had been in this substation for 4 years, which meant he'd been the law in Sweetwater Junction for everything that had happened here in that time, including the fire and the investigation and GIST, the 2 weeks that produced a finding of accident. She didn't know what he knew. She didn't know whether what she'd seen in the deed was something he would recognize or something he'd look past. She was going to find out by watching his face when she put the document in front of him. Because her father had spent 20 years teaching her that the face told you what the voice was trying to protect. The second thing was Sharon Ramirez, had owned and operated the boarding house on Sweetwater Junction's main block since before Laura and Thomas arrived in the basin. She was 60 years old and built for endurance, and had the specific quality of someone who had been watching a small town operate for long enough that she had become, in some ways, indistinguishable from the town itself. She knew things the way a place knows things, through accumulated presence rather than active gathering. If there was anything in Sweetwater Junction that connected Edward Harris to anything that should be known, Sharon would be the person most likely to be in proximity to it. She rode in past the south end of the main block, where the Harris Land and Mineral Building sat with its brass plate, catching the morning sun, and she did not look at it, because she had learned already in the past 3 days that looking at things too early, before you had the frame for them, was its own kind of mistake. Deputy Stephen Scott was outside the substation with a coffee cup in both hands, the posture of a man who has arranged his mornings around this specific ritual for long enough that the ritual has become structural. He was 38 years old, with a face that had settled into a mild and readable blankness, the expression of someone who had learned to receive information without leaking response. He looked up when she rode in, raised one hand in the usual acknowledgement. His eyes tracked her as she tied Ember and came toward him, and something happened in the 2 seconds. It happened in the seconds before he got his expression fully arranged, a small contraction, a brief tightening, gone almost immediately. She'd seen it. She filed it. She put the deed on the rail in front of him without preamble. He looked at it. She watched him look at it. He took in the county seal and the notary stamp, and the signature at the bottom, and she watched the sequence of it, what his eyes stopped on, how long they stayed, what order they moved in. His face did not visibly change. His voice, when it came, had the care of someone choosing each word before placing it. This is a notarized transfer document. If you want to contest it, that's a civil matter. You'd need a lawyer. I'm not asking you about the legal process, she said. I'm asking whether that signature looks correct to you. The pause that followed ran 3 seconds longer than it needed to. Long enough to be its own kind of answer. I'm not a handwriting specialist. She picked up the deed and folded it back into her coat pocket. All right, she said. She walked towards Sharon's. She didn't say anything else because there was nothing else to say, nothing else to say that her father had already said. Her father had told her once that silence was the most honest thing most people ever produced, because unlike words, it was almost impossible to control. You could manage what you said. You couldn't manage how long you waited before you said it. Scott had waited too long. The dining room at Sharon's had the smell of 20 years of breakfasts, coffee, and biscuits, and the wood smoke from the kitchen stove, layered into the walls and the floorboards the way smells accumulate, in places where the same things happen every morning for a long time. Sharon was wiping down a table when Laura came in, the practiced motion of someone who had done this particular task so many times it had become involuntary, something the hands did while the mind was elsewhere. She looked up, and did the thing that told Laura something was different from ordinary, thing was smarter. She set the cloth down and pulled out the chair across from the table. She'd just cleaned and sat in it, which was not something Sharon did during the morning rush unless the occasion required it. Laura sat across from her. You came in because of the paper, Sharon said. It wasn't a question. You know about it. This town is very small, Laura. Laura wrapped her hands around the coffee cup that Sharon had poured and placed in front of her without being asked. Because Sharon did things like that, anticipated the need before the need was stated, which was one of the reasons people told her things they didn't tell other people. She made it easy. Not through particular warmth, but through a kind of attentive competence that made you feel handled in the best sense of the word. Outside the window, the main street was beginning its morning. A wagon moving south. 2 men talking in the gap between the general store and the feedlot, the ordinary infrastructure of a small town going about its day. Tell me what you know about Harris, Laura said. Sharon looked at the window for a moment. Her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the moment of saying it. "The man who burned your barn," Sharon said, "still eats dinner at the oak table down the street every Friday night. His name is Edward Harris." The coffee cup was warm under Laura's hands. She held onto the warmth, the solid ceramic reality of it, while something cold moved through the rest of her. She didn't react. Not visibly. This was the thing her father had modeled for her so consistently that she'd absorbed it without noticing. The capacity to receive information that should knock you sideways and simply incorporate it. Go still. Process it without the processing showing on the outside. It had like coldness. It seems like Keats when she was a child watching him work. She understood it differently now. Not coldness, but discipline. The recognition that the moment you let your face tell the other person what you're feeling, you've handed them information about your position that they didn't have before. "Tell me what you saw," she said. Sharon told her. The night of January 14th, she'd been walking home from her neighbor's place later than usual, taking the East Field shortcut because it cut 15 minutes off the walk, and the night was clear enough to navigate without a lantern. She'd come around the eastern edge of the Clark property, and she'd seen two men leaving the barn area. Walking with purpose, not running, not casual, but the specific purposeful pace of people who have done what they came to do and are now leaving. The barn behind them was beginning to catch. The first light of it. Still low, still finding its shape. She'd recognized one of the men. Timothy Clark, no relation to Thomas. Just the overlap of a common name, who worked odd jobs for Harris's operations. Hardware store errands, property maintenance, whatever Harris's people needed. She'd seen him around town for 3 years. She was certain of the identification. The second man she didn't know. She'd stood in the dark in the East Field and watched them go, and watched the light building behind the Clark barn, and she had not made a sound. 8 months. Laura looked at her across the table. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me now?" Sharon looked at her hands on the table. They were the hands of someone who had spent 60 years working thick-fingered, marked, capable. "Because you came in and asked," Sharon said. "And because I've been carrying this since January, waiting for someone to come in and ask." Laura thought about this. The particular weight of something carried for 8 months in a small town where the person responsible for carrying you off your land ate dinner on the main street every Friday. The specific discipline required to keep that weight invisible every time you saw that person walk past your window. "Scott," Laura said. "Does he know any of this?" Sharon met her eyes. "Scott owes Harris. Not money. The other kind of debt, the kind that gets paid in silence." Laura sat with this. The kind of debt that gets paid in silence was a very specific thing. It meant there had been an arrangement at some point, a favor extended and accepted, and the acceptance had created an obligation that made Scott's cooperation something Harris could count on without having to ask for it explicitly. The most effective kind of leverage was the kind that didn't require activation, that sat in the background of every interaction and shaped behavior without anyone needing to mention it. She finished her coffee. "I need you to write down what you told me," Laura said. "Date, time, what you saw, what you identified, in your own words." "As specifically as you can," Sharon nodded. The nod of someone who had already decided to do this before she was asked. "When?" "Today. When you have time. Keep it here until I come back for it." She left money on the table for the coffee and walked out. She stood on the boardwalk outside Sharon's for a moment. Down the block to the south, the Harris Building's brass plate caught the sun exactly as it had on the way in. She looked at it directly this time. Edward Harris had arrived in Sulphur Basin 11 years ago. She knew this from the county records, from the pattern of property transfers that she'd begun tracing 3 months after Thomas died, when the numbness of early grief had given way to something more purposeful. He'd started small, 1 parcel, then 2, then a company registration. Then the geological survey contracts that gave him the ability to identify which land had what underneath it before the owners knew to wonder about the question. He'd built carefully and patiently, which in another context might have been admirable. And the thing that made it not admirable was the method. The geological survey for Parcel 14, her property, had been conducted the previous April. She'd found the record of it at the county assessor's office 6 weeks ago, attached to the back of the property file, filed under contractor documentation. The conclusion, in the dry language of professional surveyors, was clear enough when you understood what you were reading. Significant silver indicators across the eastern section of Parcel 14. Estimated yield requiring further assessment. Harris had known since April what was under her land. Thomas had died in January. She walked to the county records office and spent 2 hours with the transfer files for the 2 adjacent properties that had sold to Harris in the previous 2 years, and what she found confirmed the pattern she'd been building in her head since spring. Both properties had experienced incidents before the sale. The Hendricks Westsu had collapsed. The Gaza barn had caught fire. Both incidents had been classified as accidents. Both properties had sold to Harris Land and Mineral within 6 months of the incidents. She wrote down the dates and sat with what she'd written. A pattern was not a fact. She knew this. A sequence of events that looked connected was not the same as events that could be proven connected. Her father had been clear about the difference. The pattern told you where to look, not what you'd find when you looked. The looking was its own separate work. But the pattern pointed somewhere, and she knew where it pointed, and now she had something she hadn't had before. A witness who had placed a specific person connected to Harris at a specific location at the specific time the fire started. That was the thread. The question was what pulling it would do. She rode home and spent the afternoon redirecting irrigation from the South Creek to the North Field, which Harris's people had partially cut off, by closing the diversion valve on the Hendricks Channel, a discovery she'd made that morning. The valve closed to a trickle, positioned that way deliberately because that position didn't occur through rust or settling. She worked until the light went and then stood in the yard, in the cooling air, and looked at the property and thought about what she had, and what she needed, and what she was going to do about the gap between them. She had a forged deed, a geological survey, the pattern of the adjacent properties, Sharon's account, and the growing certainty, built from weeks of observation, and now sharpened into something harder by the deed in her coat pocket, that the person behind all of it was sitting in a well-maintained house at the edge of this town, having made the calculation that she would made the calculation do what the Hendricks family and the Gaza family had done. She wasn't going to do that. She went inside and made dinner and sat at the table alone and wrote a letter. It took her an hour to get it the way she wanted it, precise, specific, ordered causally rather than chronologically, the way her father had taught her to structure any account that needed to be clear to someone who didn't already know the context. She described the deed, the geological survey, Sharon's account, the pattern of adjacent property incidents, and what she believed connected them. She copied the key details from the deed onto a separate page. She described the differences between the forged signature and Thomas's actual signature as precisely as she could. The letter was addressed to Richard Ashby in Reno, her father's colleague, later his friend, a man who had spent 30 years working mineral rights disputes and property fraud cases, and who had, in her father's description, the particular quality of someone who could look at a mess and see the shape of it. She didn't know if he'd take the case. She didn't know if he'd even remember her. She'd last seen him at her father's funeral, 4 years ago, briefly, in the way you see people briefly at funerals. But he was the person she knew who knew this kind of law, and knowing someone was the beginning of everything. She sealed the letter. She'd take it to the post office in the morning. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark listening to the basin settle into its night sounds, the creek at the south end, something in the scrub to the west. the ordinary quiet of a place that had been here long before any of the people arguing about it and would be here long after. She thought about Thomas. Not the way she usually thought about him in these nighttime hours, which was with the particular weight of the missing, the way a room feels when something that was always in it is gone. She thought about him, the way she'd thought about him when he was alive practically, as a person in the world who had opinions and preferences and the habit of carrying things alone while he figured them out. He would have told her to be careful. She was going to be careful. She was also going to go to the post office in the morning, and then she was going to come home and do the farm work, and then she was going to wait, which was its own kind of work, the kind that required more discipline than any physical task she knew. She closed her eyes. Sleep came quicker than it had in weeks, which was either a good sign or no sign at all. And she'd stopped trying to read signs into ordinary things. The message from Sharon came on a Thursday evening, carried by the hardware store boy, who'd been given a coin and a folded note and instructions to deliver it without discussing it, which he executed with the seriousness of a 12-year-old who has been entrusted with something important. The note said, 3 men. Rode in this afternoon. Staying at the saloon. Asking about the Clark widow. Laura read it by lamplight and put it in the stove. She sat at the kitchen table and thought through what this meant in practical terms. 3 men sent to Sweetwater Junction meant Harris had decided that the 30-day window on the deed transfer was not going to produce a voluntary signature and had moved to the next step in whatever sequence of steps he'd mapped out when he decided he wanted this land. The next step after persuasion was pressure. She'd seen this pattern in the adjacent property cases, though in those cases the pressure had taken the form of economic disruption, rather than direct confrontation. The Hendricks, the Gaza barn fire. He'd already used fire once here, and it hadn't produced the outcome he wanted because she was still on the property and she was still not signing anything. So, 3 men. She went to the barn. Ember was standing at the stall partition with her ears in the middle position, aware, not alarmed, tracking the ordinary sounds of the evening. Laura opened the tack box and checked the Colt she'd been carrying for 8 months, the one that had been her father's before it was hers, a single action army in .45 caliber that she had cleaned and checked every week since January, because maintaining it was something she could do precisely, and the rest of her situation had not been something she could do precisely. She was not a gunfighter. She had never wanted to be one, and did not want to be one now. Her father had taught her to shoot. Her father had taught her to shoot because he believed the option should exist, that knowing how to do something and choosing to do it were 2 separate decisions, and the first decision was one he wanted her to have made before she needed to make the second. She put the Colt in the holster at her hip. She did not saddle Ember. This time, she stayed. She opened the side door of the barn and stood in the shadow of the interior, with the door cracked and the view of the yard in front of her, and she waited. Patience was something she'd been building for 8 months, and she had enough of it now to sit with the uncertainty and not make it into something it wasn't. 3 men in a saloon was information. It wasn't a crisis yet. She would let it become what it was going to become, and respond to what it actually was rather than what she was afraid it might be. She waited. They came at 2 in the morning. Ember heard them first. The change was absolute and immediate, the mare going from standing relaxed to standing fully alert between one breath and the next, head up, ears locked forward, nostrils flared. Laura had already been awake, sitting on a hay bale with her back against the barn wall, and the cracked door, giving her a view of the yard. But the change in the horse's posture was the signal she'd been waiting for, and she was on her feet and at the door before she'd consciously processed why. She counted time. Ember could register a human presence at significant distance when the wind was right. The wind tonight was coming from the south, from the direction of the main road. She had maybe 5 or 6 minutes before anyone crossed the fence line. She used them to move through the side door, and around the exterior of the barn, staying flat against the structure, until she reached the corner that gave her the angle on the yard and the house and the south gate. She pressed into the shadow and waited. 3 shapes came through the gate. She'd known there would be 3, and there were 3, which confirmed that Sharon's information was accurate and current, which made it more useful than information often was. They spread across the yard in the practiced arrangement of people who had done this kind of work before, the middleman stopping 20 feet from the house, the other 2 fanning to either side, each covering a different angle, professional enough to use geometry. Not professional enough to check the barn, the middleman knocked on the front door. His voice had the specific calibration of someone who had learned to project authority without triggering the fight response, controlled volume, neutral tone, the voice of someone who had done this many times and preferred it to go the easy way, Mrs. Clark. Mr. Harris sent us with a final offer. There's no reason for this to be complicated, no answer from the house. Because there was no one in the house, he knocked again. Same voice, same calibration, the one on the right young, she could tell by the impatience in how he was holding himself, the weight shifting, the hand that had already drifted toward his hip without his necessarily knowing. It said something about her not being inside. The third man, the quiet one on her left, had turned to face the barn. She stepped out of the shadow. "I'm here." The response was immediate. All 3 turned, weight redistributed, hands moving, and she let the moment settle before anyone committed to anything. She kept her own hand near the holster but not on it. Drawing. Before a situation required, drawing was a decision you couldn't take back, and she'd decided weeks ago that she was not going to make decisions she couldn't take back if she could avoid it. Ronald Sanchez. She'd connected the name to a face through Sharon, who had seen him in town before on similar errands for Harris. He was 45, broad, still with the stillness of professional habit. He looked at her the way she was looking at him, the mutual assessment of 2 people deciding what kind of situation they were actually in. Brian Thompson was on her left. 22, maybe 23. The impatience had a specific signature at that age, the need for something to happen because waiting was intolerable. The belief that readiness was the same as action. He was the one she had to watch. George White was on her right. He was the quiet one, the one who'd turned to face the barn, and he was standing now with the stillness of someone who was not here by choice in the way the other 2 were here by choice. His shoulder alignment was slightly wrong, left lower than right, the weight of something he was carrying internally expressing itself in how he stood. She spoke to Sanchez because Sanchez was the one who would receive it. "Mr. Harris's offer is $400 for a deed that my husband did not sign. Thomas was alive when that deed was dated and dead 10 days later, and 2 of Harris's employees were leaving my barn while it was catching fire." She kept her voice at the same level as his had been, not loud, just precise. "That's not a business offer. That's a confession waiting for someone to pay attention to it." Something shifted in Sanchez's face, not fear. A recalibration. Thompson moved. Not a full draw, the beginning of one. The shoulder drop and arm extension that preceded the hand reaching the grip. It was the impatience expressing itself as action before the brain had completed the cost-benefit calculation, which was the specific danger of youth in these situations. She'd already shifted her weight to her right foot when he started moving. The shot took Thompson in the right shoulder, not the chest. She'd chosen that in the half-second between seeing him begin to move and making the decision, because she was not here to kill anyone, and she intended to be able to live with every choice she made tonight, and in the morning, and in all the mornings. After Thompson went back 2 steps and sat down on the hard ground, and made a sound that was real pain without performance, which told her something about him she hadn't known before, that he wasn't, whatever he wasn't theatrical about it. She turned the Colt to Sanchez. He hadn't moved. His hands were where they'd been. He was looking at her with the specific attention of a man revising his assessment. "Fast," he said, Not particularly, she kept the gun level. I knew when he was going to move. That's not the same thing as fast. She looked at White. He hadn't touched his weapon. He was standing exactly where he'd been when she'd stepped out of the shadow, and he was looking at Thompson on the ground with an expression that was not the expression of a man calculating his next move, but the expression of a man confronting a consequence he hadn't fully anticipated. "Mr. White," she said. He looked up. "You have a daughter in Elko." He went very still. "Go home to her," she said. Not unkind, not performing kindness either. Just accurate, the most useful thing she could offer him. Tonight. "Don't come back here." George White looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she didn't try to name or hold on to, because it wasn't hers to name. Then he walked through the gate and into the dark, and she heard his horse moving off toward the north road. She looked back at Sanchez. "Take Thompson to the doctor," she said. "Shoulder wound. He'll survive it. Then go back to Harris and tell him this. I've sent a copy of the forged deed to a lawyer in Reno. If I don't make contact with him in 7 days, he takes it to the Nevada State Journal and the federal marshal's office in Carson City. She let this settle. Harris has a week to decide whether this stays a local matter or becomes a federal fraud investigation." This was half true in its specifics and entirely true in its substance. She had the copy. She hadn't sent it yet. The lawyer in Reno was real. The consequences were real. And the truth of those things was solid enough to stand on. Sanchez looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has spent his career working for people who controlled situations and has just encountered a situation that someone else is controlling. "For what it's worth," he said finally, before he turned to help Thompson up, "he won't stop because of this." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking him to stop. I'm telling him what happens if he doesn't." She watched them go through the gate. Thompson, moving with the stiff care of a man with a shoulder wound, being supported by someone who knew how to support it. She stood in the yard until the sound of their horses faded south. Then she went back to the barn. Ember's ears had come forward and were tracking the departing sounds, and then, as the sounds faded, relaxed back to their neutral position. The mare turned her head towards Laura and exhaled the long, slow exhale of an animal that has been alert and is now releasing the alertness. Laura stood in the barn doorway for a while. The basin was dark and quiet around her. No sound now but the creak at the south end, and the wind in the scrub, and the ordinary breathing of a horse at rest. The night smelled of dry earth and cooling air, and the faint mineral sharpness that she'd long since stopped distinguishing from the air itself. 200 acres. Thomas had been alive on January 4th. She went inside and made tea and sat at the table with it, and did not sleep, because there were things she needed to think through before morning, and the thinking required being awake for it. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she needed. She thought about the gap between those two things and what it would take to cross it. By the time the sky began to go from black to gray, she had the shape of it. She was at Scott's substation by 8. She gave him the statement in the straightforward terms that the situation required 3 men. 2 in the morning, 1 drew on her. She fired in self-defense. 1 shoulder wound. 1 departed voluntarily. The ringleader carrying an instruction from Edward Harris. She gave him names. She gave him the timeline. She answered his 3 procedural questions, all of them. About the physical facts of the confrontation. None of them about the context that had produced the confrontation and signed the document he prepared and set in front of her. Then she looked at him. "Stephen," she said. He looked up. "Do you remember who you were before he got to you?" She said it quietly and without accusation, because accusation was not what she was going for. She said it the way you say a true thing to someone who has been avoiding it directly. And then you let it sit, because the sitting was the point, the pressure of the thing left in the room after the words were done. Scott said nothing. She walked out. She spent the rest of the morning at the farm doing the physical work that still needed doing, regardless of everything, the fence post that had been leaning since August. and was now past the point of being ignored. The North Field irrigation that she'd redirected to the South Creek 2 days ago and needed checking. She worked until early afternoon and then came in for water and stood at the kitchen window and thought about what came next. What came next was the letter. She'd been refining it in her head for 3 days, and she sat down at the table and wrote it out, not the version from the night after she'd received the deed, which had been more emotional in its architecture than she'd wanted, but the version she'd been building since then, the one that was organized by cause rather than by chronology, the one that gave Ashby the shape of the thing rather than the sequence of events. She described the forged deed and the specific way she could identify the forgery. She described the geological survey and what it showed about the silver deposit under the eastern section. She described Sharon's account, what Sharon had seen when, who she'd identified, why she hadn't come forward before. She described the pattern of the Hendricks and Garza properties. She described what had happened the previous night. She was specific about names and dates throughout, because her father had always said that vagueness was the enemy of credibility, not deliberate vagueness, which announced itself, but the inadvertent vagueness that came from assuming the listener already knew what you were telling them, which they didn't, and the assumption created gaps that undermined the account. She sealed the letter and put it by the door to take to the post office in the morning. 3 days later, the letter from Reno arrived. Richard Ashby wrote in the cramped, precise hand of a man accustomed to writing in spaces where legibility was professional necessity. He wrote 4 pages. The first acknowledged receipt and indicated he'd reviewed what she'd sent. The second was his assessment of the legal situation, which was specific and unsentimental. The forgery of a deed in a county property transfers was a federal matter under statutes clarified in an 1875 Ninth Circuit ruling. The ledger copy she was describing would function as probable cause for a subpoena of the original. Sharon's testimony was the weakest element legally, but the most compelling, evidentially, because it provided the physical link. The third page was about Timothy Clark. Ashby had contacts in the California State Attorney's Office. He'd made inquiries. Clark had been located in Stockton at a lumber operation, and had, according to the contact, made statements over the past several months to people he apparently trusted with things he shouldn't have trusted them. With statements vague enough to be deniable, but consistent with the knowledge of someone who had participated in something he wished he hadn't. He had not come forward voluntarily. He was unlikely to come forward voluntarily. But a federal subpoena would locate him, and a man under federal subpoena related to what was developing here had a different relationship to silence than a man who was simply hoping things stayed quiet. The fourth page was instructions. He needed Sharon's statement notarized and formally signed. He needed the deputy in Sweetwater Junction to formally contact the federal marshal's office in Carson City and open a case file, because without law enforcement initiating the federal timeline, the process would be too slow. He needed Laura to make no further direct contact with Harris or anyone in Harris's employ, and he intended to contact the federal marshal's office himself within the week. He closed with a single line that she read 3 times. The strength of what you have is not in any single piece, but in the pattern, and courts understand patterns when someone is patient enough to present them clearly. She put the letter in the box under the bed, the box that had started with Thomas's letter from Tonopah, and now held something different, not the record of what she'd had, but the case for what had been done to her. She went to find Daniel at the county records office, and then she went to find Sharon. Sharon wrote her statement the morning after Ashby's letter arrived. Laura sat at Sharon's kitchen table while she did it, not guiding the language but present, while Sharon found her own words for what she'd seen, which took about 40 minutes and produced something in the plain, direct prose of a woman who had spent 60 years saying what she meant. No flourishes, no hedging, date, time, location, what she saw, who she identified, why she was certain of the identification. She signed it in front of Daniel at the county records office, who notarized it with the particular gravity of a man who understood that some documents were more consequential than others and treated them accordingly. Laura carried the certified copy to Sharon, who put it in an envelope and sealed it herself. "What happens now?" Sharon asked. "I take this to Ashby, and I need to talk to Scott again." Sharon across the table. Sharon looked at her across the table with the expression she'd had when she'd first told Laura about the men leaving the barn, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it begin to happen and feels the specific relief and terror of that. "He's not going to make it easy," Sharon said. "I know Harris has had 4 years of Scott. That doesn't come undone in a conversation." "No," Laura agreed, "but it can start to come undone. And that's different from it not coming undone at all." She went to Scott's. He was at his desk when she arrived. He looked up without the careful blankness she'd seen the previous times, which was itself informational. The blankness had required maintenance, and the maintenance was starting to cost him. What was underneath it was not easier to read, but it was more honest. The way a worn thing is more honest than a new one. She sat across from him without being invited. The irrigation valve on the North Hendricks Channel was closed to a trickle the morning after the confrontation at my property, she said. "I want it on record that I believe this was done at Harris's direction. I also want it on record that I've sent a formal account of the deed forgery and related events to a lawyer in Reno, who has already made contact with the federal marshal's office." Scott wrote this down. She waited. "He put his pen down, Laura," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not softness exactly, but the worn-through quality of something that has been holding a weight for too long. "What happened with Harris?" 4 years ago. A situation with my brother." He stopped, started again. "He had a theft charge from the mine he worked. He didn't do it, but the company wanted someone to take it, and he was the convenient option. Harris had pull with the county attorney. He made it go away. He looked at his hands on the desk. He presented it as a favor. I accepted it as a favor. It was only later I understood what accepting that kind of favor actually meant." She looked at him steadily. Your brother know?" "No, would it change how he thinks about it?" "He'd rather have gone to trial," Scott said. "He's always been that way. He'd rather lose straight than win crooked." A pause. "He's a better man than me that way." The room was quiet. Through the window, the main street continued its ordinary activity, indifferent to what was being worked out in this office. "I need you to formally contact the federal marshal's office in Carson City," she said. "Open a case file. Ashby in Reno is already in contact with them, but it carries more weight coming from the local law." Scott was quiet for a long moment. "If I do that," he said, "Harris will know within a day. He has a contact at the commercial telegraph office. Is there another line?" "County courthouse has a direct line that goes through the courthouse switchboard. Slower, doesn't pass through the commercial operator. Use that one." He looked at her. Something settled in his face, not resolution exactly, but the moment before resolution, the last recognition before a decision is made. "How long do you need me to hold it?" he asked. "Don't hold it. Send it today. Then tell me what response you get." He nodded once. She stood to leave. "Laura," he said her name with a weight that made her stop at the door. "I haven't been the thing I was supposed to be here." She turned and looked at him. "You've got time to change that," she said. "Not a lot, but some." She walked out into the afternoon. Ember was at the rail. The sun was lower now, coming in from the west at the angle that made everything cast long shadows east. The particular quality of late afternoon light that showed the topography of things, every ridge and furrow in the dirt road visible, every board in the boardwalk, casting its own thin shadow. The truth about things at the end of the day, the way they actually were, rather than the way they looked in the forgiving softness of early morning. She untied Ember and mounted and turned toward home. The basin opened up south of town, the main street giving way to open country. the scrub and red dirt of the valley floor extending to the hills on either side. She let Ember pick the pace, which the mare always calibrated correctly, not slow enough to be inconsiderate of the time, but not pushed, moving at the pace that covered distance without costing more than the distance was worth. She thought about what she'd built in the past 3 weeks. A forged deed, a geological survey, a certified witness statement, a Reno lawyer with federal contacts, a deputy who was on the edge of doing what he should have been doing all along, and 3 men who had come to her property in the dark and left with 2 fewer members than they'd arrived with, which meant Harris had used his most direct option and it hadn't worked, which meant his next options were the kind that created more evidence, not less. Ashby had said the strength was in the pattern. She was still building the pattern. She wasn't done, but she was further along than she'd been on the Tuesday morning. She'd opened the envelope at the kitchen table with her coffee still hot. The sun went below the western hills, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees in as many minutes, the specific abruptness of Nevada evenings in late September. She pulled her coat tighter with one hand and felt the certified copy of Sharon's statement in the inner pocket, solid and flat against her ribs, and she thought, one more piece, then one more after that. She rode home in the last of the light. Ember's hooves on the hard ground, the basin settling into its nighttime quiet. The property fence line coming into view in the dusk, the shape of the house and the new barn exactly where they were supposed to be. She had work to do in the morning. She always had work to do in the morning. That, at least, was something she could count on. Sanchez delivered his report at 7 in the morning. Harris was already at his desk when Sanchez came in, which was his permanent condition at that hour. The desk ordered, the lamp lit against the early gray, the geological survey map, pinned flat on the side table with its careful colored markings across the basin parcels. He had the quality of a man who had arranged his mornings to produce a specific effect on anyone who entered the room. The effect of someone who had already been working for hours while you were still becoming conscious, which created a particular dynamic before a word was spoken. Sanchez gave the account without editorializing. He was built for this, the neutral delivery of facts in sequence, the removal of personal interpretation from professional report. He described what had happened in the order it had happened, and stopped when the facts stopped. Harris listened with his hands flat on the desk. When Sanchez finished, the silence ran for 20 seconds. Harris looked at the geological survey map on the side table. The eastern section of Parcel 14 was marked in red, as it had been since April, when the survey contractor had delivered his findings, and Harris had understood immediately and completely what they meant. Significant silver indicators, estimated yield requiring further assessment, the kind of finding that transformed a piece of dry Nevada scrub into something worth any amount of patience and any amount of management. She shot Brian, he said, shoulder. He'll recover. She knew George's name, his daughter's name too. She'd done work before we arrived. A pause. More work than we anticipated. Harris looked at the survey map for another moment. Then he looked at Sanchez. The claim about the lawyer in Reno, he said, could be real. Could be buying time. We treat it as real. He moved nothing on the desk. No further direct contact with the property or with her personally. If she's building a legal record, every direct action adds to it. He paused. There are other approaches. This was the part of working for Harris that Sanchez had learned over several years to identify and respect, if not exactly admire the man's refusal to respond to reversal with more of the same. Most people, when a direct approach failed, applied more force to the direct approach. Harris adjusted the approach. He looked at what he had and what he was losing and what he could accomplish without crossing lines that would make the resulting evidence more damaging than the goal was worth. The water access on her north field runs through the Hendricks irrigation channel, Harris said, which we own outright since the transfer. Close the diversion valve on the north connection. Make it look like routine maintenance scheduling. Sanchez nodded and contact Grover at the grain exchange. She's been selling corn through him. I want that arrangement ended. He picked up his pen. Quietly. Grover owes us a favor from the Tonopah contract. He'll do it without needing a reason. Sanchez left. Harris looked at the map. Then he looked at the window. The apple trees in the garden were losing their first leaves of the season. Small yellow shapes drifting down in the early morning air. Unhurried, indifferent. He'd planted those trees 7 years ago. The patience required to plant trees and wait for them to become trees was the same patience required for everything else he'd ever built. You decided what you were building, and you did the next necessary thing, and you did not let short-term complications alter the destination. The widow was a short-term complication. He went back to work. Outside the Harris building, on the main street of Sweetwater Junction, the morning moved through its ordinary rhythms, the hardware store opening, the feedlot receiving its first delivery wagon, 2 men talking outside the general store with the unhurried quality of men who have nowhere particular to be. The brass plate on the Harris building caught the early sun and held it for a moment, and then let it go as the angle shifted. Inside, Harris wrote in his ledger. The January entries were 3 pages back now, the handwriting as regular and unhurried as everything else he produced. Timothy Clark, $75. Special work, Eastern property. The notation that had seemed, at the time of writing, like the kind of administrative detail that existed only to satisfy his own system of accounting and would never be seen by anyone outside that system. He didn't think about the notation now. He thought about the next necessary thing, which was patience, and the thing after that, which was the thing that patience eventually produced. Laura, 6 miles south, was redirecting irrigation water from the South Creek to the North Field and cataloging the fact of the closed valve in the notes she'd been keeping since the deed arrived. She would bring that notation to Scott in the afternoon. She would add it to the picture she was building. She was not, Harris had correctly identified, a person who would eventually run out of the capacity to persist. What he had not correctly identified was what persistence in her case was actually building toward. He would find out. But not yet, not today. Jeffrey Lewis came to the farm on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the confrontation in the yard. Laura heard the horse from inside the house, single rider. Slow approach from the South Road, the specific unhurried rhythm of someone who was being careful not to arrive as a threat. She went to the window before going to the door. Single rider, coming in without urgency, stopping at the gate rather than coming through it, she recognized. Jeffrey Lewis had been processing property transactions for Harris Land and Mineral for 5 years. She'd seen him in town perhaps a dozen times over the course of those years. At the general store, at the feedlot once, at the county records office, when she'd been there doing her own research. He had the quality of a man who occupied his professional role completely, who became, in those interactions, primarily a function rather than a person. The briefcase, the measured manner, the papers laid out in precise order on whatever surface was available. She'd watched him once from the window of the general store as he'd met with the Garza family about their property. The season before they'd sold. He'd sat with them for 40 minutes, and by the end the papers were signed. And she'd watched it happen and had not understood fully what she was watching until later, when the pattern became clear. She went to the door and out to the gate without the gun in her hand, because a man who came through a gate slowly and stopped 10 feet short of the fence line had already told her something important about his intentions. He didn't come through the gate. He stopped his horse and looked at her across it. "I'm not carrying," he said. "I know." She held his eyes. "You still work for the man who killed my husband." The pause that followed was not the pause of someone preparing a denial. It was the pause of someone who has been sitting with a specific fact for a long time and has not yet found a comfortable relationship to it. I didn't know what he was going to do. The words came slowly, as if they'd been rehearsed, but the rehearsal hadn't made them easier. I bring paperwork. I make offers. What happens when I leave is not something I direct or plan." He stopped, started again with a different approach to the same thing. "I knew something was wrong after January. I've known for 8 months. I didn't know what to do with that. You're here now. I'm here now." She waited. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper and held it over the gate. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at his face while her hands were still. She'd learned from her father to read the face at the moment of offering, not the words, not the gesture, but the expression that accompanied them. Because the expression was the thing a person couldn't fully control, and therefore the thing most likely to be honest. What she was looking for was the calculation, the specific combination of guilt and self-interest that appeared on the face of a person who was offering something in exchange for something, who had done the arithmetic and decided that this particular trade served them better than silence. She didn't see it. What she saw was more complicated and less clean. The look of a man who had been carrying a weight he'd decided to put down, not because putting it down would benefit him. She could see, actually, that he'd already considered the ways it wouldn't benefit him and had decided to do it anyway. But because the carrying had become something he couldn't continue, she took the paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, the numbers clear and organized. January entries: Timothy Clark, $75. Special work, Eastern Property. "This is from Harris's ledger," she said, "the January accounting book. I copied the entry 3 days ago. I couldn't take the original." He paused. "The notation is in Harris's handwriting. I've seen it enough times over 5 years to be certain of that. Will you testify to this?" The silence this time was the silence of a man taking the full measure of a question rather than the silence of a man who didn't know the answer. He already knew the answer. He was taking the measure of saying it out loud. "Yes," he said. She folded the paper. "You understand that Harris will know it was you," she said. "You're the only person in his operation with regular access to the accounting books, I know. And that he'll move against you when he finds out." "I know that too." He looked at the property behind her, the house, the new barn, the south field that caught the last of the evening light. "I have a daughter 2 years old. I've been trying to figure out for 8 months how to be the kind of person she should know when she's old enough to understand any of this. There were things you could say to that and things that would diminish it by being said." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you for coming," she said. He nodded once and turned his horse back toward the road. She stood at the gate until the sound of him faded. Then she went inside and sat at the table and looked at the folded paper for a long time. Timothy Clark, $75. Special work, Eastern Property. Her land was the Eastern Property. She added the paper to the box under the bed. The box that now held the forged deed, the geological survey, Sharon's certified statement, Ashby's letter, and her own running notes on every development since the envelope arrived. The box was becoming an archive. The archive was becoming a case. She thought about what Ashby had written. The strength is not in any single piece but in the pattern. The pattern was getting denser. The shape of it was becoming harder to look at and not see. She made dinner. She sat at the table alone and ate it. After dinner, she wrote to Ashby with the new information, the ledger entry, Lewis's willingness to testify, the details of what the copy showed. She described Lewis's situation, the risk he'd taken, the likelihood that Harris would discover the breach of trust soon. She asked Ashby specifically about the federal subpoena process for Timothy Clark in California and whether Lewis's safety could be formally considered as part of the federal case structure. She sealed the letter and put it by the door. She sat at the table for another hour, not doing anything specific, just being in the house that she and Thomas had built together, and that she was not leaving, and letting that fact settle around her, the way facts settle when you stop arguing with them and let them be what they are. The ambush came on a Tuesday evening, 6 days after Lewis's visit. She'd been at Sharon's that afternoon not for information specifically. though information was always exchanged when she was there, but for the particular relief of ordinary conversation with someone she trusted, the specific unwinding that happened when you spent a few hours not being the person managing something dangerous. Sharon had made coffee, and they'd sat at the kitchen table and talked about things unconnected to Harris and deeds and federal cases, and by the time Laura left at dusk, she'd been more settled than she'd been in 2 weeks. She took the North Road home because it was shorter, and she'd been taking it for 6 years, and the body has its own memory of familiar routes, its own pull toward the path it knows. Ember changed a mile outside of town. Not the signal she'd come to recognize as strangers approaching the locked ears and flared nostrils and immediate alertness of the night in the yard. This was different. A more uncertain signal, something atmospheric, something the mare couldn't quite categorize. The ears moved through several positions without settling. The breathing shallowed slightly. Laura slowed her without stopping, kept her posture relaxed, her weight even in the saddle. The worst thing you could do when a horse was in uncertain alert was telegraph your own uncertainty back to them. The horse would read it and amplify it, and the loop became unmanageable. She stayed easy in the saddle and let Ember process whatever she was processing. They were approaching the narrow passage between the two rock formations. 200 yards of reduced visibility, high walls on either side. Maybe 4 meters, the road narrowing to the width of 2 horses passing. She'd ridden through it 1,000 times in daylight and dark both. She knew the ground, and Ember knew the ground. A sound from the right rock face. Very small, stone against stone. The kind of sound that could be a nighthawk landing, or could be a boot finding better purchase on an uneven ledge. The difference between those two things was that a nighthawk made the sound once. A boot made it again when the weight shifted. She heard it twice. She had maybe 10 yards before the passage reached its narrowest point, which was where someone positioned on the right rock face would have the clearest unobstructed angle downward. She didn't have 10 yards to think. She thought in the 2 seconds she had, which was enough if the thinking was already half done before the moment arrived, and she'd been thinking about threat geometry since January. She turned Ember before the passage narrowed. Not a panicked pivot, a deliberate turn, the signal given clearly and quietly through her weight and her hands. And Ember responded the way she always responded to clear, quiet instruction, which was without hesitation. They were turning before the narrow point, and Laura had her body low over the horse's neck by the time the shot came. It hit the road 2 feet behind them. The second shot didn't come. Single shooter or a shooter who hadn't adjusted in time for a moving target. Either way, the window of clear angle was already gone, and they were out of the passage and onto wider ground. And Ember was running with the efficient, purposeful stride of a horse that understood the difference between exercise and departure. She didn't stop for a quarter mile. Then she brought Ember down to a walk and held absolutely still and listened for a full minute. Nothing following. No sound from the direction of the passage but the ordinary sounds of the evening. She turned toward Sharon's instead of home. Not because she was afraid to go home, she wasn't, or not in the way that fear makes decisions for you, but because Sharon needed to know tonight, and because Laura's hands were steadier in the presence of someone she trusted, and she wanted them steady before she decided what to do next. Sharon opened the door before she reached it. One look and Sharon stepped back and let her in and didn't ask anything until Laura was sitting at the kitchen table with something warm in her hands. She told Sharon what had happened. Sharon listened the way she listened to everything fully, without interrupting, without the performance of reaction that some people offered, in place of actual attention. "He's done with pressure," Sharon said when she finished. Not frightened, stating a fact. "He's been done with pressure since the night with the 3 men, Laura said. "This is just what comes after. What comes after that? What I've been building comes after that." She drank from the cup Sharon had given her, coffee, strong, the kind Sharon made for situations rather than for enjoyment. The fire at my barn was meant to remove a complication. The 3 men were meant to scare me into signing. This was meant to remove me entirely. She set the cup down. Each step he takes creates more evidence. He knows that. Which means he's calculating that the evidence won't matter if I'm not here to present it. Then you need to move faster than he expects. Ashby is already moving. Scott sent the wire to Carson City 2 days ago. She looked at Sharon. What I need right now is to go back to that passage in the morning and document what's there before anyone disturbs it. And tonight? Tonight I stay here. Sharon didn't argue with this. She made up the room at the end of the hall, the one she kept for guests who needed it, and brought extra blankets because the nights had turned cold. Laura didn't sleep much. But she lay in the dark and thought clearly, which was almost as useful. In the morning she rode back to the passage at first light, alone, because she needed to think without managing anyone else's response to what she was looking at. The ground was readable. She climbed to the right rock face by the natural step in the formation and found what she was looking for. 2 sets of boot prints in the dust on the ledge, different scissors, different treads, both showing the settled impressions of people who had been standing in one place for an extended period. An hour, maybe more. 2 cigarette threat stubs. 1 shell casing, a .44 caliber, the kind a rifle would use, and which was consistent with the flat trajectory of a shot fired from an elevated position downward. 1 shot, which told her the shooter had been positioned for a single, clean opportunity and hadn't improvised when that opportunity changed. She took the shell casing and wrapped it in her handkerchief and put it in her coat pocket. She climbed back down and stood on the road where the shot had landed, and looked back up at the ledge and worked out the angle. From that position, if she'd been moving forward instead of turning back, the shot would have struck her from behind. This was not a warning. Wasn't a version. There was no version of this that was designed to frighten her into compliance. A warning was fired into the air or at the ground before you reached the target. This was fired at the target. She rode to the courthouse. Deputy Marshal James Whitmore arrived on the noon stage 4 days later. Ashby had written to say he was coming. He'd written the specifics. Whitmore had 22 years in federal service, 12 of them handling land and mineral fraud cases in the Western circuits. And he was not the kind of man who arrived at a situation and needed the situation explained to him. He arrived and read it, and then asked the questions that moved it forward. That was Ashby's description. Laura had held it in mind since reading it and found, when Whitmore walked through the courthouse door, that it was accurate. He was 50 or thereabouts, travel-worn, with the specific quality of attention that develops in people who have spent decades distinguishing between accounts that were true and accounts that were true but unprovable, and accounts that were neither. He looked at her with the same assessment she'd been giving him since he came through the door, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Scott had arranged the courthouse back room. The table was plain wood. The light from the single window was adequate. Whitmore sat down and spread Laura's materials in front of him, everything she'd prepared and organized in the 2 days since Ashby's letter arrived, laid out in the causal order she'd settled on after considerable revision. Not chronological, causal. What produced what? The shape of the thing rather than the sequence, he read in silence. She watched him read. He registered on the geological survey, a slight shift in how he held the paper, a slight pause before he turned to the next page. He spent longer on Sharon's certified statement than on anything else, reading it twice, which told her he understood what it was doing in the case, not the strongest element legally, but the one that made the shape visible to a person in a jury box, who might otherwise find the document evidence too abstract to hold. When he finished, he looked up. The witness who gave this statement, he tapped Sharon's page. Her certainty of identification. She's known Timothy Clark by sight for 3 years. She's seen him in the hardware store, at the feedlot, at the grain exchange. She saw him in moonlight from a distance she could walk in 2 minutes. She's certain. Laura paused. She's been carrying this for 8 months because she was afraid of Harris. People who are uncertain about what they saw don't stay afraid for 8 months. They talk themselves out of it. Whitmore looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just heard something put more precisely than he expected. The ledger entry he moved to Lewis's copy. Your witness is prepared to testify to this in a federal proceeding. He is. He's been staying locally since he came to me. I'd describe his situation as precarious. Harris doesn't know yet exactly what Lewis provided, but he suspects Lewis is a vulnerability. I'd like his safety to be formally considered as part of the federal case structure. I'll want to speak with him today. I'll arrange it this afternoon. The attempt on the North Road. He looked at Scott's notes, which included the shell casing description and the trajectory assessment Laura had provided the morning after. Deputy Scott's identification of the method. Scott answered from where he was sitting against the wall. The description matches a contractor named Cole Whitfield, who does claim security work for mining operations in the region. Harris has used him before. I've sent his description to your office. I received it. Whitmore set that page down. The sequence I'm proposing is this. He looked at both of them. We locate Timothy Clark in California first and place him under federal subpoena before we execute any warrant here. If Clark is in federal custody before Harris can warn him, he becomes the corroborating testimony that turns the ledger entry from suggestive to conclusive. He paused. After Clark is secured, we execute the warrant on Harris's office building and residence simultaneously. We move for the ledger, the deed transfer files, and all associated correspondence. How long for California? Laura asked. My contact there should be able to locate Clark within 48 hours. If Clark accepts the subpoena without resistance, and I expect he will, men in his position generally want the decision made for them. We move here within the week. She absorbed this. 1 week? Can you maintain your presence here without Harris becoming aware of why you're here? I traveled in a personal capacity, not official. I'm registered at the boarding house under my traveling name. He looked at her. I'd estimate 12 to 18 hours before someone who knows me by sight connects my presence to something official. That's the usual pattern in towns this size. Sharon Ramirez owns the boarding house, Laura said. She's a material witness. She won't tell Harris anything he'd want to know. I'm aware of her role. He gathered the papers into their order. Mrs. Clark, from the point at which I file with Carson City. This is a federal case. The pace, the sequence, the decisions about when and how to move those are mine. He looked at her steadily. I need you to let that be true. She looked at him. I can do that, she said. She meant most of it, which was honest. That evening she rode home in the particular low light of late October that made everything visible at its actual scale. No softening, no flattering angles. Just the thing itself in the clear afternoon. The basin opened up south of town the way it always did, the scrub and red dirt extending to the hills on either side, and she let Ember find the pace that the distance required. She thought about what Ashby had written. The truth doesn't need you. You just need to find it and put it in the right order. She'd found it. She'd put it in the right order. Now she had to let it go to someone else's hands, which was the hardest part, the part nobody told you about when they talked about building a case. The building was the part that required everything you had. The handing over was the part that required something different, the willingness to trust what you'd built enough to stop holding it. She rode home. She went to the barn before the house. Ember's stall first. The evening routine, the physical reality of caring for an animal that had been with her through all of it without being asked to understand any of it. She stood in the barn in the last of the light and thought about Thomas. She thought about the morning they'd come to the county records office to file the original deed. A Tuesday in spring, 6 years ago. Thomas had been quiet on the ride into town, the specific interior quiet of a man processing something that mattered to him, holding it where it could be felt before it became ordinary. The clerk had handed back the registered copy with the county seal, and Thomas had looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her with the expression she'd spent 9 years learning to read. She thought, I am going to get that deed back. She went inside and made dinner and sat at the table alone and ate it. 1 week, Whitmore had said. She could do 1 week. The wire from Whitmore came on the third morning. He'd been in contact with Carson City twice by then. The California contact had located Timothy Clark and made initial approach. Clark had not agreed to testify voluntarily, which Whitmore had expected, and he had not refused to accept a federal subpoena, which Whitmore had also expected. The response of a man who wanted the decision made for him because making it himself required a kind of clarity he hadn't yet found. Whitmore told her this in the courthouse back room at 6 in the morning, which meant he'd been there since before she'd gotten up, which meant something had changed in the timeline. The situation at the boarding house, he said. Lewis was sitting in the corner. He'd been at Sharon's for 4 days, and the quality of him had shifted in that time, not deteriorating, but changing in the way of someone who has made a large decision and is now living inside the consequences of it rather than the anticipation of it. He had the particular stillness of a man waiting. Someone came to his house while he was at Sharon's yesterday afternoon, Laura said. Pamela was home alone. A man she didn't know, polite, said he was there to discuss Mr. Lewis's employment situation. He left when Pamela told him to. Whitmore looked at Lewis. Harris doesn't know the full extent of what you provided, Whitmore said. But he knows you're a vulnerability, I know. Lewis said. Is your wife willing to relocate temporarily? She's been wanting to since I told her what was happening. He paused. I have a daughter. I'm aware. Whitmore looked at Laura. Is there a location in town that Harris wouldn't move against directly? Sharon's, she said. Too visible. Too many people in and out. Moving against Sharon's boarding house would be visible to the entire town. Can you arrange it? Tonight, Whitmore nodded. He looked at his notes. I'm moving the timeline, he said. I'd planned to wait until Clark was formally in federal custody before executing the warrant, but the approach to Lewis's home tells me Harris is consolidating faster than I'd anticipated. He paused. I'm going to execute the warrant on Harris's office tomorrow morning at 8. Clark isn't secured yet, Laura said. Clark will be contacted tonight by the California office. Whether or not he's formally in custody before we move here, his location is known to the federal system, and Harris can't reach him without crossing lines that would add to his charges. He looked at her steadily. The window in which the ledger is still where Lewis last saw it is closing. I need to move before he relocates it. She absorbed this. The acceleration of a timeline she'd been building toward for weeks. The particular feeling of something moving faster than expected, which was both relief and its own specific kind of danger because fast could mean mistakes. And mistakes at this stage were catastrophic. What do you need from me tonight, she asked. Arrange Lewis's family at Sharon's. Then go home. Be available at 7 tomorrow morning. He looked at both of them. And Lewis, I need you at the courthouse tomorrow at 7 as well. I'll need you to identify the ledger entry in person. When we locate the book. Lewis nodded. The nod of a man who has been waiting for something to do and has finally been given something specific. She rode home that evening with Ember moving at the pace the horse chose, which was always right. The sun was low, and the shadows ran long to the east, and the basin had its evening quality, the temperature dropping, the air sharpening, the smell of the desert at the end of its daily warming. She went to the barn first. She stood with Ember in the last of the light and let the evening be what it was for a few minutes, the physical reality of a horse and a barn and a piece of land that was hers, the smell of hay and wood and the cooling air through the open barn door. All of it exactly what it had always been, regardless of everything that had been done to take it from her. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him the way she'd thought about him when he was alive, not with the weight of loss, which was always there in the background like a note held too long. But practically, as a person who had been present in this place and would have had opinions about what was happening and what should happen next, he would have said, Be careful. She was going to be as careful as the situation allowed. She was also going to be at the courthouse at 7 in the morning, with everything she had, and what she had was enough. What she'd built over weeks of patience and work, and the specific kind of discipline that her father had modeled for her across 20 years of watching him find to shape things and present them clearly, it was enough. She didn't need it to be more than enough. Enough was sufficient. She went inside. She made dinner. She sat at the table in the lamplight and looked at the room around her. The kitchen she and Thomas had built, the window that faced east to catch the morning sun, the door that opened onto the yard where the new barn stood. She thought, tomorrow. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Sleep came. 5 hours of it, clean and unbroken. The sleep of someone who has done the work available to be done, and has released the rest to the process. In the morning, she would ride to the courthouse. In the morning, Whitmore would execute the warrant. In the morning, the thing she had been building since the Tuesday, she'd opened an envelope. At her kitchen table with coffee, still hot in her hand, would either hold or it would not. And either way, she had built it as well as she knew how to build it. And her father had told her once that you could not ask more of yourself than that. The truth didn't need you to be perfect. It needed you to be precise and patient and willing to stay in the work long after it stopped being manageable. She had stayed in it. She closed her eyes. The basin settled around her into its nighttime quiet. Tomorrow. Laura's coffee was hot again on the morning of the warrant. She'd been awake since 4:30, which was an hour earlier than she needed to be. But the hour had not been wasted. She'd spent it at the kitchen table going through the box under the bed. One final time, not because anything in it needed checking, but because she needed to hold the pieces in her hands one more time before she handed them to someone else permanently. The forged deed, the geological survey, Sharon's certified statement, Ashby's letters, Lewis's copy of the ledger entry, her own running notes, 43 pages now, organized by date and cross-referenced by name. She'd built this from nothing, from a Tuesday morning, and a cold cup of coffee and a signature that wasn't quite right. She put everything back in the box and put the box on the table rather than under the bed, because she was taking it with her this morning, and she didn't want to forget it in the dark. She saddled Ember in the pre-dawn quiet. The mare was alert, but not agitated, the specific forward attention of an animal that has learned to read its person's states, and understood that this particular state of focus was different from the focus that preceded danger. This was the focus that preceded conclusion. Ember had been present for enough of this that she'd developed in her animal way, a relationship to its shape. Laura rode north. The basin was dark on either side of the road, and the sky was beginning its first gray lightning to the east. The particular gradual quality of Nevada dawn that never rushed itself. She'd ridden this road so many times in the past 8 months that her body knew it without her attention, which left her attention free for other things. She thought about the order of what would happen. Whitmore at the courthouse at 7, Lewis with her, Scott meeting them, the warrant executed at 8. The sequence was laid out and she'd been over it enough times that it had settled from anticipation into something more like a plan, which was calmer than anticipation and more useful. She thought about Harris. She'd spent weeks building a picture of him from the outside, from the county records, and the pattern of property transfers, and the things Sharon had observed over 20 years of watching him operate. What she hadn't had was the inside, the texture of his own thinking about what he was doing, and she'd constructed that from inference. A man who believed in systems. A man who believed that the landscape of the basin could be improved by being properly managed, which in his definition meant managed by him. A man who had looked at other people's land and seen potential that they were, in his calculation, too limited or too sentimental to realize. He didn't think of himself as the kind of man who did the things he'd done. That was the part she'd come to understand most clearly over the course of these weeks. He thought of himself as the kind of man who made difficult decisions that smaller-minded people couldn't bring themselves to make, and that self-understanding was what made him more dangerous than simple greed would have been. Simple greed was recognizable from outside. A man who had convinced himself of his own necessity was something harder to see and harder to move. She arrived at the courthouse at 6:55. Whitmore was already in the back room, which surprised no one. Lewis was there, seated at the table, with his hands around a coffee cup, and the particular stillness of a man who has committed to a course of action, and is now on the other side of all his ambivalence about it, in the place where the only thing left is to do the thing. Scott came in 2 minutes later. He'd been watching the Harris building from his office window since 5 in the morning, and his report was brief. No unusual movement. No one entering or leaving. The building dark until 6:30 when the lamp in the front office had come on, which was consistent with Harris's daily pattern. Whitmore spread the warrant paperwork on the table and went through the sequence. The warrant covered the Harris office building and the Harris residence. It authorized seizure of the accounting ledger for the January calendar year, all deed transfer documentation for Harris Land and Mineral Company operations in Sulphur Basin for the preceding 3 years, and all private correspondence connected to those operations. 2 deputy marshals from Carson City had ridden in at first light and were waiting at the south end of the main block. California made contact with Clark last night, Whitmore said. He's accepted the subpoena. He'll travel to Nevada under federal escort in 10 days. He looked at Lewis. His preliminary statement confirms 2 persons were present at the Clark property on the night of January 14th. He's prepared to name the second person. Lewis received this with the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a confirmation that he'd believed was coming, and is now finding that the belief and the confirmation are 2 different experiences. He's coming, Lewis said. Not to anyone specifically. He's coming, Whitmore confirmed. Laura looked at Lewis. The ledger copy you brought me, she said. Ashby used it to locate Clark. Without something concrete showing the payment and the notation, there was nothing to connect Clark's presence to a specific instruction from Harris. She held his eyes. You built the bridge that gets Clark here. Lewis looked at the table for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and drank it and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish what she'd said. And he seemed to understand that. Whitmore looked at Laura, Mrs. Clark. He put his hands flat on the warrant papers. When we execute this morning, your role is as the primary complainant. You're present because your knowledge of the materials is useful for identification purposes. You're not directing the search. You're not engaging with Harris directly, unless I indicate otherwise. He paused. If he attempts any kind of direct statement to you offer, justification, anything you look at me, understood. If the situation becomes hostile in any direction, it won't, she said. Not from him. Not in a room with a federal marshal and witnesses. Harris manages perception. He'll manage it until the moment he can't anymore. And then he'll manage the aftermath of not being able to manage it. Whitmore looked at her. You've spent time thinking about him. I've had weeks, and not much else to do with them. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the space where one might have been. He gathered the warrant papers and stood. They left the courthouse at 7:58. The main street of Sweetwater Junction in the last minutes before in the morning had the quality of a place that was going about its business without knowing it was about to become the backdrop for something it would be talking about for years. That the hardware clerk was opening the front shutters. 2 men were coming out of the feed lot with an empty cart, their conversation carrying on the still morning air. The doctor's wife was on the front step of the house beside the office, doing something with a potted plant that apparently required her full attention. Sharon was in the doorway of the boarding house. Laura didn't look at her directly, but registered her presence in the way you register someone you know well when they're standing at a deliberate distance from something important, close enough to witness, far enough to not be part of it, which was exactly where Sharon would have placed herself. The Harris building sat at the south end of the block. The brass plate caught the morning sun. Whitmore tried the door and it opened, which was either Harris's ordinary habit or a deliberate choice. And Laura had stopped being surprised by the ambiguity of ordinary things in situations that weren't ordinary. Harris was at his desk. He was wearing his good coat. His desk was in its permanent order files, at exact angles, pen parallel to the edge of the blotter. The cup of coffee precisely where a cup of coffee belonged. The geological survey map on the side table, its colored markings as precise as they'd been every other time anyone had looked at it. He looked up when they came in. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit at some undetermined point in the recent future and had prepared a posture for it. Not surprise. Not the particular controlled blankness of someone trying to hide surprise. The composed attentiveness of someone who had decided that composure was the correct instrument for this situation and had deployed it. Whitmore stated the warrant in the formal language. The law required precise, unhurried, without editorial. He handed Harris the paperwork. Harris read it. All of it. He was one of those people who read legal documents and completely regardless of the circumstances, because complete reading was both professional habit and the only way to identify, in the document itself, any vulnerability that the executing party might have left themselves open to. It took him 4 minutes. The room was quiet while he read. When he finished, he looked at Whitmore first, then Scott. Then passed both of them to Laura. She'd thought about this moment in different versions across different nights. She'd built it in her imagination with different emotional textures. In some versions, she'd felt the full accumulated weight of 8 months arrive at once, all of it landing in the specifics moment of standing in the same room as the man who had ordered Thomas's death. In other versions, she'd felt nothing, the strange blankness that could accompany the arrival of something you'd been moving toward so long, that the arrival didn't feel like what arrival was supposed to feel like. What she actually felt was neither version. She looked at Harris the way she'd looked at the rock formation on the North Road the morning after the ambush, with clear attention, with the specific focus of someone reading a situation accurately and filing what mattered and releasing what didn't. He was a man who had made a sequence of choices. She was a woman who had made a different sequence of choices. The difference between those sequences was what Whitmore and 2 deputy marshals were currently acting on. That was the whole of it, reduced to its actual components. And she found that the actual components were smaller and more manageable than the versions she'd imagined. Harris looked at her for a long moment. She could see him reading her face the way she was reading his, looking for something specific, some expression that told him what she was feeling. Because what she was feeling was information about her position, the desperation that might make her unpredictable, the satisfaction that might make her careless, the grief that might make her human in a way that could be used. She gave him none of those things. Not because she didn't feel them, she felt all of them in their proportions, but because feeling something and showing it were 2 different decisions, and she'd made the second one before she walked through the door. The deputies began working through the office. The filing cabinet nearest the window, the second cabinet, the drawers in systematic order, the professional efficiency of people who had done this particular task many times and had reduced it to a reliable sequence. The ledger was in the second filing cabinet, 3rd drawer down. One of the deputies carried it to Whitmore and set it on Harris's desk, deliberately, because the warrant required that identification be made at the location of discovery. Whitmore opened it to January. He found the entry without difficulty because he'd known what he was looking for and where it would be in a ledger, organized the way Harris organized everything. Timothy Clark, $75. Special work, Eastern Property. He looked at Lewis. who was standing in the doorway behind Laura. Lewis stepped forward far enough to see the page. He looked at the entry, and then he looked at Whitmore and nodded once. The nod of confirmation. The nod that said, "That is the entry I copied, that is the handwriting I described, that is what I saw." Whitmore looked at Harris. "Mr. Harris." He closed the ledger. "I'm placing you under federal arrest on charges of document fraud, conspiracy in the unlawful transfer of real property, and conspiracy in connection with the death of Thomas Clark on or about January 14th, 1879. He continued through the formal language. Harris listened to all of it with the attention of a man trying to identify where the structure of the case had a vulnerability. He didn't find one in the language, which was correct, because Whitmore had spent 22 years making sure his language was correct. When Whitmore finished, Harris was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Laura, not at Whitmore. Not at Scott. At her specifically, which was a choice, and choices in moments like this were always intentional. "I built most of what functions in this valley," he said. His voice was level. Conversational, almost. The voice of a man making a statement he considered to be simply true. The infrastructure, the water systems, the supply contracts that keep the operations running. "I built that." She let the silence after his words sit for a moment. "Thomas built something too," she said. "The same volume as his. The same absence of theater." "You decide his wasn't worth leaving alone." Harris looked at her. Something moved through his face. In the moment after, she spoke something that was not guilt and not regret, but was more honest than either of those things would have been. The specific expression of a man who has just heard something true that his framework for the world doesn't contain a place for, and who is, for the first time in a very long time, without a prepared response. Then Scott stepped forward with the cuffs, and the moment was over, the way moments are over completely, without ceremony, replaced immediately by what came next. They came out the front door onto the main street at 8:23. The sun was fully up by then, past the low angle of early morning, and into the direct light of midday approach, which showed everything at its actual scale without softening. The hardware store's open shutters, the feedlot wagon, the boardwalk boards with their wear patterns from years of foot traffic. Everything exactly what it was. The street had filled in, not a crowd. Sweetwater Junction didn't produce crowds, didn't have the population density for them. But a street's worth of people in the middle of their morning who had registered, through the particular ambient awareness that small towns develop over time, that something was happening that was different from what usually happened. The feedlot men had stopped their cart. The hardware clerk was in the doorway now, instead of behind the counter. The doctor's wife had put down whatever she'd been doing with the plant and was standing still. And Sharon Ramirez was in front of the boarding house, with her hands at her sides and her apron tied, and her face holding the expression of a woman who had waited 8 months for this specific morning, and was now in the specific experience of watching it actually happen, which was different from waiting for it, which was different from remembering it. Harris walked between Whitmore and Scott with the particular posture of a man who has made a decision about how he is going to conduct himself through an experience he cannot change. He walked with his eyes forward. His coat was still good. His posture was still composed. The composure was the last thing he was managing, and he was managing it with the consistency of a man for whom composure had always been the primary instrument. What he could not manage was what the street was doing around him. He'd spent 11 years in this town, managing the perception of what he was building: the brass plate, and the apple trees, and the good coat, and the Friday evening presence at the only restaurant, the accumulation of gestures that together produced a version of himself that the town could live alongside without friction. He had been, in his own understanding, a kind of foundation that the town rested on without knowing it. Now he was walking down the middle of that town with his hands behind him, and the foundation he'd built was simply the street he was crossing. Ordinary ground beneath his feet, belonging to nobody and everybody, The way streets belong to nobody and everybody. The man outside the general store, a rancher from the east end of the basin, someone Laura recognized but didn't know well, took his hat off. Just that, a small gesture. Not directed at Harris, not directed at anyone specifically. Just a man removing his hat because the moment seemed to require it, the way certain moments do. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved dramatically. The town did what towns do in moments that become part of what a place knows about itself. It witnessed. It stood still and let the thing happen, and was changed by having been present for it. In the slow accumulating way that places are changed by things that happen in them. Harris walked through the witness without acknowledging it. His eyes stayed forward. Laura watched him from across the street, where she'd stopped when they came out the door. Not because she'd been told to stay back, she hadn't. She fought, but because she's understood instinctively that the street scene belonged to itself, and she was a person watching it, rather than a person in it. Lewis was beside her. "It's done," he said, almost to himself. "The arrest is done," she said. "The rest takes time," he nodded, which was the nod of a man who had learned, in recent weeks, to distinguish between those two things and had come to understand that the distinction mattered. Sharon caught Laura's eye from across the street. Laura, not high, just a lift, a small acknowledgement of a woman across 50 feet of morning air. Sharon raised hers back. It was not a celebration. It was something smaller and more real than that, the recognition between two people who had been in the same thing from different positions some seasons, and had come out the other side of it still standing. That was the whole of it. That was enough. When Harris and Scott and Whitmore had turned at the end of the block, and the sound of their boots on the boardwalk had faded, the street returned to its ordinary motion. The feedlot men moved their cart. The hardware clerk went back inside. The doctor's wife picked up whatever she'd been doing. The brass plate on the Harris building caught the sun exactly as it had on every morning previous, which was a strange thing to notice, and she noticed it anyway. She turned and walked toward Sharon's. Whitmore came to the farm that evening. He rode out himself rather than sending a message, which told her before he spoke that what he had was worth the specificity of a face-to-face conversation. She met him at the gate in the cooling, late afternoon, the sun already behind the western hills, and the temperature dropping in the abrupt way of October evenings. "Clark's preliminary statement came through from California an hour ago," Whitmore said. "More detail than we had this morning." He looked at the property behind her, the house, the barn, the south field in the last of the light. "He's named the second person. A man currently working at a mining operation in Idaho. Federal subpoena is being executed there tonight." She absorbed this. The second person from the barn, named, located. Coming into the federal system, does Harris know Clark has given this detail? His lawyers have been informed of Clark's cooperation as required by procedure. The specific content of what Clark has said, no. Whitmore looked at her steadily. It closes the last gap in the physical chain. The ledger connects Harris to the payment. Clark's testimony connects the payment to the act. The second person corroborates Clark's account and removes the possibility that Clark is the only witness to his own involvement. Is that sufficient for conviction? What we had this morning was sufficient for a strong federal case. What we have tonight is a complete federal case. He paused. I want to be direct with you about what that means and doesn't mean. Harris has resources. His lawyers are competent and they'll use every available mechanism to extend the timeline. Trial is 8 to 14 months from now, at the earliest. The outcome of that trial is not something I can guarantee. I know that. What I can tell you is that the case as it exists tonight is the strongest case I've taken to a federal prosecutor in several years. Ashby agrees. The prosecutor who's been assigned in Carson City agrees. He looked at her. You built this from a forged signature, and no resources and considerable personal risk. I've been doing this work for 22 years, and I want you to understand that what you did here is not ordinary. She looked at the gate between them, the wood of it, the iron fittings, the ordinary fact of a gate she and Thomas had installed in the second year they'd owned the property, because the original rope closure wasn't sufficient for keeping Ember in when the mayor got interested in the Southfield. "My father used to say that the truth doesn't need you," she said. "You just need to find it and put it in the right order." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "Your father was right," he said. "And the people who can do that find it and order it without letting what they want the truth to be distort what it actually is are rarer than most people understand." He gathered his reins. "Ashby in Reno is your primary contact from here. I'll be in Sweetwater Junction through the end of the week, closing out the initial documentation." He turned his horse. "Whitmore," she said. He stopped. "Thank you for coming," when Ashby asked. He looked back at her. "Thomas Clark was fortunate in his wife," he said. Then he rode before she could answer, which she suspected was intentional. She stood at the gate for a long time after the sound of his horse faded north. The basin was settling into its evening, the temperature falling degree by degree, the air sharpening with the mineral cold that came off the hills after sundown, the sky going from the pale blue of late afternoon to the deeper blue that preceded dark. 200 acres in every direction from where she was standing. The east field, the south creek, the new barn she'd put up in March with hired hands because you couldn't farm without a barn, and she wasn't leaving. She'd never been leaving. She went inside. She made dinner and sat at the table and ate it slowly, in the lamplight, in the kitchen that she and Thomas had built. She thought about writing to Ashby and decided to wait until morning when she could think more clearly. She thought about writing to her father's memory, which was the kind of thought that came to her sometimes in quiet moments. Not grief, exactly, but the specific wish to be able to report to someone who would have understood every decision she'd made and why she'd made it. She thought about George White and whether he'd made it back to Elko. She thought about Brian Thompson and his shoulder wound, and whether he'd found a different line of work. She thought about Ronald Sanchez, who had been professional and unsentimental, and had told her, leaving her property that night 2 months ago, that Harris wouldn't stop, which was the only honest thing anyone on Harris's side had said to her throughout all of it. She thought about Jeffrey Lewis at Sharon's boarding house, getting ready to sleep in a rented room in the town he'd worked in for 5 years, and that had become, in the course of a few weeks, a place he could no longer navigate in the way he'd navigated it before. He'd lost his job. He'd moved his family twice. He'd walked up to a fence gate, in the dark with a piece of paper, and changed the entire direction of what was possible. She thought about Sharon, who had carried something for 8 months in a small town, where the person she was carrying it about ate dinner on the main street every Friday, and who had written it down when asked and signed her name to it when the time came. She thought about Scott, who had spent 4 years being a version of himself he didn't like, and had spent the past 3 weeks becoming something else, one decision at a time, none of them easy and none of them clean. She put her plate in the basin and washed it and put it away. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. The sleep came quickly, which surprised her, and then didn't, because the body knows when a thing is done in a way that the mind sometimes takes longer to catch up to. 3 weeks later, on a Friday morning in November, a letter arrived from Daniel at the county records office. Not from Ashby. She'd been hearing from Ashby regularly since the arrest, updates written in his cramped, precise hand that tracked the legal process in Carson City with the same calm thoroughness he brought to everything. The case was formally filed. Harris had entered his not guilty plea. His lawyers were competent and well-funded and were using every available procedural mechanism, which Ashby described without alarm, because he'd been watching competent and well-funded lawyers do this for 30 years, and he understood which mechanisms were effective and which were theater. This letter was from Daniel. It was short, 4 sentences, and it said that with the forged deed formally voided by the federal court's preliminary order, the original registered deed for parcel 14, Clark Homestead, was available to be returned to the rightful owner upon request to the county clerk's office. She read it, twice at the kitchen table. Then she set it down and finished her coffee. Then she rode Ember to town. She left the mare at the rail outside the records office rather than the rail outside Sharon's, which was her usual stop in town, because this errand was its own thing, and she wanted to do it directly, without other stops along the way. The morning was cold, the particular dry cold of early November in the basin, and Ember was wearing a heavy blanket that Laura had put on before the ride. The ritual of care that had accumulated over 4 years into something that moved without thinking about it. Daniel was at his counter when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it, took his glasses off, cleaned them with the cloth he kept in his vest pocket, put them back on. Then he went to the back room. She waited at the counter. The records office had the smell it always had: old paper, and the wood of the shelves, and something she'd never been able to identify. That was probably just the accumulated breath of years of documents being handled in a closed space. She'd spent many hours in this room over the past months, reading transfer files and assessment records, and the paper trail of 11 years of Edward Harris operating in Sulphur Basin. She knew the room in its professional capacity now, as a place that held the documentary evidence of how things were. Daniel came back. He was carrying a certified envelope, the county seal on the front. He set it on the counter between them. "This is the original," he said. "Registered the spring of '73. Certified copy for your records will be available next week if you want one as well." "I'll come back for that," she said. She picked up the envelope. And stood on the front step of the courthouse building in the November morning and opened it there, because she didn't want to wait until she was home, and she didn't want to open it inside in the official space. She wanted to open it outside in the ordinary air, with Ember at the rail 20 feet away. The deed was 6 years old. The paper had the slightly yellowed quality of something that had lived in a file for a long time and had taken on the atmosphere of the place it was stored. The county seal was clear. The notary's mark was where it had been on the day they'd filed it. The legal description of Parcel 14 was exactly as she'd memorized it over the course of the past months: the meets and bounds, the acreage, the section and township markings. At the bottom were 2 signatures: Thomas Clark. The T pulled long to the right, the crossbar extending past the letter into the white space to the right of it. The particular physical habit of a man who'd been writing his name that way for so long he didn't know he did it. And beside it, in her own younger handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who was 24 years old and buying land for the first time, and was so glad to be doing it that she'd pressed the pen a little harder than necessary, the letters coming out slightly bolder than her usual hand, her own name. Laura Clark, both of them, on the same document, in ink that had been sitting in this paper for 6 years unchanged, exactly as it had been the day they'd walked out of this building together and ridden home to the property that was now officially theirs. She stood on the courthouse step and looked at both signatures for a long time. She thought about the morning they'd signed it. Thomas had been quiet on the ride in the particular interior way that meant he was holding something he cared about. The clerk had handed back the certified copy, and Thomas had looked at it the way he looked at things that were exactly what they were supposed to be, with the quiet recognition of someone who doesn't need to say what he's feeling, because the feeling is complete enough without words. She folded the deed carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat, flat against her chest, which was where she'd carried the forged deed for weeks without knowing it was forged. The difference between those 2 pieces of paper, the tweezine between the weight of the thing that had been done and the weight of the thing she was now carrying home, was not something she could have put into words precisely. It was more than the difference between false and true, though it was that too. It was this specific weight of something recovered, not restored to what it had been. Because the past 8 months were part of it now, and couldn't be subtracted, but recovered in the sense of being held again by the right hands. She untied Ember. She mounted and turned south toward home. The main street of Sweetwater Junction was in its late morning activity. The hardware store busy, the general store open, a wagon being loaded in front of the feed lot. She rode through it at Ember's chosen pace, which was unhurried and deliberate, the pace of a horse that had been going back and forth on this road for 4 years and knew exactly how long it took and had made peace with that knowledge. She passed the space where the Harris building had been, was still physically, the building still standing with its brass plate, now the subject of federal asset proceedings that Ashby had explained in a letter 2 weeks ago. The plate still caught the sun. The building still sat at the south end of the block. But the thing that had given it its specific weight in the town's atmosphere was gone, and what remained was just a building, which was what it had always been underneath everything that had been done in it. She rode past it without stopping. The road south opened up, and the basin spread around her, and the hills were blue in the middle-distance haze that came in November when the air changed quality, and the light went softer without being less clear, a combination that seemed contradictory until you'd lived in it long enough to understand it as its own thing. She thought about what came next. The trial was months away. Ashby would write in his regular letters. There would be depositions and scheduling and the procedural mechanisms that Harris's lawyers would deploy, which were real and would take time, and which she had accepted as the reality of the process rather than a reason to question the outcome. Clark would come and testify. The second man from the barn would come and testify. Lewis would testify. Sharon would testify. She would testify for as many hours as it took, in whatever form was required. And in the meantime, the farm, the North Field, was getting water. The grain exchange arrangement was restored, Grover having come to her 3 weeks ago to resume the contract, which she'd accepted because she needed the income, and because the practical decision was more durable than the satisfying one. The fence post she'd replaced in October was solid. The South Creek was running well for the season. The work was what it had always been. The land required the same things regardless of what had been done to it, and what had been done to recover it. The particular discipline of farming, the requirement that you show up every day to the same tasks and perform them with the same care, whether the context of your life was settled or completely unsettled, was something she'd come to understand differently over the past 8 months. Not as a burden, as a practice, as the thing that had kept her functional when functionality was the only available resource. She turned Ember onto the property road, the gate, the yard, the new barn catching the November light. She unsaddled Ember and put her in, and gave her the afternoon grain, and stood in the barn for a few minutes, in the way she always stood in the barn when she needed to let something settle. The smell of hay and wood and horse, the sound of Ember eating, the specific quality of barn quiet, which was not the absence of sound but the presence of sounds that belonged. She put her hand on Ember's neck. The mare was warm, the warmth of an animal that had worked a moderate morning and was now comfortably settling into the afternoon. Laura held her hand there for a moment and felt the slow rhythm of the horse's breathing, the unhurried, regular breathing of a creature that was exactly where it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing, without any part of itself in conflict with any other part of itself. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the morning they'd first stood in this barn, together, the old barn before January, the one she'd stopped being able to think about directly, for several months after the fire, for several months, and had been able to think about again more recently, in the gradual way that the mind returns to things it had to put away temporarily. They'd been in the barn because Ember had had a stone bruise on her left front foot, and Thomas had been checking the treatment, and she'd been standing beside him in the specific way they stood beside each other, when they were both looking at the same thing, which was close but not touching, the way people stand when they've been with each other long enough to be comfortable with proximity that doesn't require demonstration. He'd looked at the foot and said the treatment was working, and then he'd looked up at the barn roof, at the particular quality of light that came through the gaps in the boards on south-facing barns in the early afternoon, and he'd said, "The light's good in here," which was an observation without obvious purpose, the kind Thomas made when he was comfortable enough to notice things without needing them to mean anything. She'd agreed with him. She agreed with him still. She went inside. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and held the cup and looked out the east window, which caught the afternoon sun at this time of year through the bare branches of the cottonwood at the property's east edge. The deed was still in her coat pocket, which was hanging on the hook by the door. She would put it in the box under the bed later. Not the same box, she was going to get a better box, something with a proper latch. Because the documents deserved a better container now that they were what they were supposed to be, rather than what they'd been built into being over the past months. Tomorrow she would write to Ashby with the update about the deed's return. She would write to Sharon, not with information but just to write to her, because Sharon had been present for the whole of this, in the specific way that a place is present solidly, without being asked, and she deserved a letter that was just a letter and not a request for anything. She might write to Lewis as well. She hadn't yet. She didn't know what to say to him that wouldn't sound like either too much or too little, and she was still working out the right proportion. What he'd done had cost him more than she could repay, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But the accounting between people wasn't always the most important thing about what had happened between them. She drank her tea. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor in the slow progression it made in November, the sun lower in the sky than it was in September, and the angle different, the rectangle of light on the floorboards longer and narrower than it would be. In summer, this was the kitchen. These were the floorboards. This was the afternoon light on the particular Thursday in November that she was in, which was different from every other afternoon in every other Thursday she'd ever been in, and also the same, in the way that days are the same when they happen in a place you've decided to stay. She was staying. She'd known that from the beginning. From the first morning she'd opened the envelope and known the signature wasn't right. From before that, from the January morning when she'd understood that Thomas wasn't coming back and had made, before the grief had even fully arrived, the quiet foundational decision that she wasn't going anywhere. This was her land. 200 acres of basin floor and scrub, and the South Creek and the silver deposit down in the eastern section that was still there, still in the earth, belonging to the property, and therefore to her. Whatever the courts eventually decided about the mineral rights proceedings that Ashby had indicated would be a separate matter, handled separately after the criminal case resolved. The land didn't know about any of that. The land was what it was. The tea went cool in her hands, and she noticed and didn't mind. Outside the window, the cottonwood was bare, and the afternoon was going toward the particular quality of late November afternoon that she'd always thought of as the basin's most honest hour, clear, cold, the light neither flattering nor harsh, just present and accurate, showing things as they were. She sat in it. She didn't need it to be anything other than what it was. Eventually she would get up and do the evening feeding, and check the water, and do the last rounds of the property before dark. Eventually she would make dinner and sit at this table and eat it. And the lamp would be lit and the basin would go dark outside the window. And the ordinary process of a night on the property would proceed as it had proceeded for 6 years. But not yet. For now she sat at the table in the afternoon light in the kitchen she had built with Thomas, with the deed in the coat on the hook, by the door, and she let the day be exactly what it was, which was hers, which had always been hers, which was, in the end, the only thing she had ever been trying to get back.